That should be our intro music. You whistling.
Yeah, long enough off.
That's quite good, John.
Yeah.
It's the theme song. It's the theme song to my world.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy Wednesday.
Hi.
It's Wednesday. Yeah.
It is Wednesday.
All day, as my dad used to say. Okay, what's been happening? I feel like there is a little bit of good news to share, Aaron.
There is. I got engaged. I popped a question and she said, yeah.
I believe she said something slightly stronger than that.
Yeah, there was it was probably a 2-second pause that felt like eternity, but then it was followed by a fuck yes. So
Fuck yes or fuck yes.
the tone I choose to have heard was fuck yes.
Oh, that's brilliant news.
Excellent.
Yes, very happy.
Aaron's fiance, Myron, is just delightful. So this is fantastic news.
Yeah, I'm pretty stoked.
It's hard for any of us to match that news, though.
Yeah.
So whatever we say now sounds really lame.
I made my bed.
Isn't it lovely? In the tribe team over the last few weeks, we've had a new baby, a new engagement.
Yeah. So now it's just up to you, Lainey and Jack. You got to.
Is this where I start singing Lion King Circle of Life?
Please don't. Jack, I think you know what you need to do now.
Not anytime soon.
He's got his whole life ahead of him. Stop. He has until he spent 6 months straight in Airlie Beach. I'm not letting him make any life decisions.
Fair enough. All right. Shall we get into some news?
Cool.
Sounds good.
Where should we start? Should we start maybe with the last episode of the Founder series?
Yeah, episode 3.
Yeah, about...
Had quite a different feel to the two before.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important for the credibility of the series, right? That it exposes or represents all the facets and the sides of entrepreneurship. And this was definitely a different vibe to the Canva episode or the safety culture episode.
Yeah, that's what I love about it, though. I think there's this stigma or like a stereotypical startup tech founder. And I love that we get to see all the different types. And I loved your comment, Lainey, like talking about founders can be eccentric, and they tend to be, but we can have all different types of founders that still build very successful companies.
Yeah, and I think even Scott Farquhar said in the episode that Fred, the former CEO, and it does say at the start or at the end of the episode that once the episode was filmed, Fred actually stepped down as CEO of Finder. And Scott said he's an individual, but whether that's irrelevant if actually he has a vision that people can get behind and he executes, that shouldn't matter. And I think that's true to an extent, but it's hard, right? I think like we are certainly all have our own brand of weirdness in this little quartet, but
some more than others, but yeah, keep going.
But I do wonder, like there's eccentric, right? And then there's or different, and then whether that becomes a liability down the track or not, and whether those eccentricities in an ideal world are allowed, or whether it just seems to be something that's okay if you're actually really successful.
The part of the entrepreneurial impulse from my point of view is sitting in a world very dissatisfied, looking at it, wanting to change it and bring new things. And that dissatisfaction can sometimes come on very strong and almost very painfully. When I watch that, it's hard not to have empathy for someone that just really is deeply so in the trenches, and it's hard to describe it, but I think
my read was Fred is a very creative person, right? And I do think there is a requirement for creativity to be an entrepreneur. It doesn't seem to get zeroed in on as much, but it is a necessary requirement, because how do you solve a problem that hasn't been solved before? Or how do you build something that's never been built before if you don't have a certain level of creativity? The challenge, I think, with really creative people is they're often incredibly sensitive people as well. And not always, but just there is a tendency, I think, and that sensitivity ends up being something which, when things don't go so well or aren't going well,
does it translate to then frustration, sensitivity aren't going well. You're not seeing your creativity come to life.
Yeah.
That comes to frustration. Frustration then ends up in a team dynamic, causing frictions. And the episode touched on some of those things. And ultimately, it was almost like there was a journey there of an individual coming to accept their part in the process, and that their functional bit is at the beginning, not at the implementation side, and therefore he was best placed finding those opportunities and getting out of the way.
Yeah. And that seeming to be he was relegated to that conclusion, but it was a painful process. And there was discussion, and we see this a bit too, about his tendency to blow shit up if it's not going well. And his co-founders saying that they recognize that tendency. And while he blew up his personal life, or took some responsibility for blowing up his personal life during that, he also was blowing up the business. And the co-founders saying we could see that tendency was being directed inwards, which was going to be bad for the business. So we had to still direct that tendency or that trait in a more constructive way.
Yeah. And there's some patterns in my consulting life and using a sort of life cycle model. There's this part of the organizational model called the founder's trap, where the founder gets trapped by the business, or they almost get ejected. And a bit like in the wild, if you find baby birds and mum's not around, you should never touch the baby birds, because if mum comes back and smells you on them, she rejects them because they're no longer seen as hers. And what I see time and time again, there's a phase where the founders start to lose a bit of control. They're not getting things that they want out of the business. This thing no longer looks and smells as a reflection of them or what they wanted. And they enter a sort of a rejection phase where, and the way it manifests is nothing's good enough. They're doing it wrong. You're going in the wrong direction. You're not implementing it. And the default way is, if I blow this thing up, I'm protecting it, myself, a chance to start again. And that's why before entrepreneurs got dual class shares and those kinds of things, the life cycle also had the phase of the unfulfilled entrepreneur, because what would happen is investors would then eject that energy because they just wanted some calmness, some system, some process. And you end up in this world of the unfulfilled entrepreneur. And if we look at Steve Jobs and his journey, he got ejected from the system, so to speak. It took him 10 years to really mature and go and do that. Meanwhile, Apple was being systemized and processed. Now, it went too far, but when Jobs was able to come back, more mature leader, still the great visionary product person, Apple now had more systemic ability to handle that stuff. And then we saw Apple just jump in the manner that it did. And to me, it's a story of understanding that different people are required at different phases. We have strengths and weaknesses. And Luke Anir in that recording we've just done talked about getting to the point where you understand where your weaknesses are, having some humility. Once you've learnt that you need that humility, you can then start to get people into the organization better than you and get out of the way, and the thing starts to grow. And yeah, I found it fascinating.
Yeah. And there is a common thread, like the interview with Luke, the interview with Adrian, different conversations we've had, and the series, like this thread of almost like a young naivety that turns into a humility. And each of them have said hiring someone smarter than you that can fill those gaps. And that does require the founder to let go and have that ability to trust. And Don, you talk about it all the time, like building teams of high mutual trust and respect. But
it's not a natural trait of an entrepreneur, though, to trust or to be okay with giving up some control.
Yeah. I mean, the entrepreneurial energy has that high intrinsic locus of control, that belief that we can do all things and we say yes to everything.
And also, I think I've talked about this before, they are naturally wired to pick control over comfort.
Or to seek what they can control, because they're dealing with so much uncertainty.
Yeah. There was some other comments in the episode around, like one around rule breaking. It talked about Finder breaking a bunch of rules and getting tapped on the nose with a rolled up newspaper for it. And then there was, and it seemed like it was a bit celebrated in the episode, even though Fred and his co-founders made a concession, I think later, that was actually, there was a tendency for them to break rules but take it a little bit too far, and that being that putting the company at risk. But then Scott Farquhar made the comment that it's the tendency to break rules that made Fred or makes Fred a great entrepreneur. Do you agree that is a necessary requirement?
Or necessary or not is an interesting one, but I do think it's advantageous.
I think there's a spectrum. By definition, to change something, something has to break almost. So there has to be some level of breaking the rules. And then we have a spectrum of I'll do a little bit, and then there's Elon at the other end where I'll sacrifice humans in self-driving technology that isn't ready yet and watch them burn alive with a grin on my face. In between there, I guess the question becomes is what level of rules is acceptable to break? And I think you have to be a rule breaker, but where should one draw the line?
Yeah.
And in terms of the rules that we're talking about here in this episode, it was Google's rules around what was allowed in terms of backlinking. We're hardly talking about humanity.
Yeah.
Which we'll get to later in this episode, by the way.
Yeah, I think we should chat about that.
Triggered.
But the other one would be Uber. Uber was a brute force attack on legislation. Like they were paying driver fines. If a car was impounded, they'd buy the driver a new car until there was such mass adoption on the consumer side that the population wanted it and governments changed laws. So that absolutely breaking the rules was their go-to-market strategy. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there has to be some rule breaking.
Okay, interesting. There was a lot of conversation about ambition in this episode, but I think it differed from previous episodes in that the ambition was very much personal. In the episode before around Canva, Melanie and Cliff talked a lot about their ambition being to build a great company, but then to use that in order to build wealth that they can use to help people. Fred's comment was very much, he wore that ambition on his sleeve around how it was important to him and for his personal gain. Do you think that is unusual, or do you think he was just being honest? And most people have most of the entrepreneurs we work with have that same personal ambition.
You go first.
Yeah, I'm a poster child for all this. What's that? You reminded me this morning, Jack, of the Dr. Geo podcast, but adulthood is just clearing the debris of your childhood. And a lot of that ambition that we see manifesting in humans is actually it's a result of some stuff that happened that then creates an impulse to prove the world wrong or prove people wrong, or often it's a self-worthiness kind of thing. So I think there's a high correlation with entrepreneurship, and some hide it better than others. But unless you wake up in the morning without something, a voice or a feeling somewhere of a bit of a chip and needing to prove something, it's hard to go off and get the motivation to pull off the stuff that these people pull off. I don't think that there are others that, I think as long as there's a motivation somewhere, but they've all got this intrinsic feeling that often they can't explain. Like both in all the podcasts, I try and ask, how do you cultivate the behavior? And in both Luke and Adrian and even a bit of Kim, they can't tell you, and they don't tell you. If you listen to the answer, they've given you no prescriptive ability for you to go and cultivate it. And what I always find interesting for that is that there's this innate thing there that they can't actually express, and therefore we can't directly learn from it. But it's there, it's an impulse, and it came from somewhere. And I think it's
a good point, because they often do have things that they are doing, but they don't articulate it as a specific thing that they implemented for that purpose. But
it's because they're not taking a paint by numbers approach though, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's their DNA of who they are.
Yeah.
I do often wonder, I'd love my kids to be entrepreneurs, and that's just a selfish bias that I have. And I do wonder if I'm not screwing them up enough mentally now that they can be a successful entrepreneur in the future.
That's true.
Why do you want them to be entrepreneurs, and why do you think you're screwing them up?
Well, not screwing them up. That's the problem.
I'm not screwing them up. And I think to really be a motivated entrepreneur, there is some sort of childhood issue that you are dealing with that you're trying to overcome and prove to the world that becomes a motivator.
And why do you consider it selfish, and why do you want them to be entrepreneurs?
It's probably all my own biases of what entrepreneurship means. That I see it as the least riskiest career path because you have control. And I think in a world of increasing ambiguity and tech innovation, I think the concept of employment and employees is shifting. So I think the entrepreneurial skill set will set them up for a future career path, whatever they want to do. So
for me, I don't use the word entrepreneur. If they end up being entrepreneurial, that's fine. What I look at with my kids is how do you get them in an ability to really manage all the shit that's going to come at them in life, change, problems, all of that. Now, entrepreneurs are able to do that, and therefore that's a vocation, if you will. Pardon?
Are they though? So yeah, sure, they can solve problems on the fly and in fact have to build part of their business. But I think there'd be an argument that a lot of entrepreneurs are actually pretty emotionally challenged in certain ways. And
yeah, I don't want that bit. I just want all the good bits. I want it just to be high functioning people that can.
The thing is, there's trade-offs for everything.
Oh,
sure. Yeah, you're right. I do. Yeah, I don't know. This is a much deeper conversation, but it starts with I think you've got to plant your flag on what success looks like.
Yeah.
And that often has a whole lot of biases, and people like me who have our own stories and journeys of what success needs to look like have to be very careful not to try and overlay that on others and being able to just sit with others having their own journey. But there is a fear as we all know, as a parent, that how do you set them up so they can actually function? But you're right, maybe just work at the Department of Transport 9 to 5 and you'll be happier.
No, that's not what I said at all. I'm just curious. And it's interesting because maybe just to round out the conversation of the Fred Shabester and Finder episode is there was a comment in there, which was also one in the safety culture episode where he talks about his daughter gets interviewed about how he gets interviewed, I think, first around how do you build these companies but manage your family life. And he said, I don't really, I try to engage with my kids on games and I try to spend time with them. And then his daughter pipes up from the background going, yeah, but then you're just glued to your phone. And he makes the comment that he hopes they forgive him later and what a sacrifice it has been for him to do that, to miss out on bits of his kid's life. And I thought it was an interesting comment because, and a lot of entrepreneurs will make that comment, they see themselves making a sacrifice, which I think they are, but it doesn't necessarily have mutual agreement from the other people in the family, including the kids.
Yeah, I think there's two things. One, it's generally never by mutual agreement, and the rest of the family is seconded into it because for all of an entrepreneur's ability to communicate a vision quite often and a mission and a direction, because they're running at such a rapid pace and live most of the time in their head, the communication to those around them is actually pretty fucking poor. And it's a constant challenge to keep on top of it. But in my professional vocation, working with entrepreneurs quite often, the majority of them that I've worked with that are in their 60s, 70s and 80s, the sacrifice was not worth it. Even those, and I've had the privilege of working with people that have the $1 billion portfolios and asset base. A lot of the time they would swap a lot of that for all the stuff that they missed.
Is that a hindsight bias? Because once you've set yourself up, it's easy to go back and go, oh, but I should have done this.
Maybe. But then if humans are prone to hindsight biases, if you value tomorrow's happiness above your point in time happiness today,
yep.
I guess all I would say is that unhappiness is just generally probably a human condition issue. But putting that aside, a lot of the sacrifices. And then it's even worse if you don't have the assets and the freedom and the ability to do whatever you want and to then support the family and see them making choices that others can't. Mm-hmm. If you're then in the cohort that didn't get that bit, it's even more fucking hard.
Which is the bigger cohort too. Those that tried it and didn't make it, but sacrificed along the way, that it's blues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other story that was published this week was around crowdfunding platforms. And I think the headline was something like startups defend crazy valuations or something along those lines. And for those listening who aren't so familiar with crowdfunding platforms, the likes of Equitize allow companies to raise capital from, sorry, Don?
Yeah, Equitize, Virtual, those kinds of.
Virtual, yep. Allow companies to use their platform to raise capital from retail investors who can invest as little as $10,000. I think the companies can raise up to $5 million on the platform, and they need to do it through an intermediary like a Virtual or Equitize. And I think the comment was that these companies, I felt like the vibe of the article was saying these companies and the intermediaries are taking advantage of these investors because these valuations that these companies are raising at are monstrously high.
Yeah.
And I think there was a comment around, firstly, we should talk about the difference between sophisticated investors and retail investors. So as a VC fund, under our financial services license, we can only raise capital from sophisticated investors, which is actually a measure of your net wealth or your assets. Retail investors are investors who don't meet those asset tests. So mum and dad investors, they often get called out there. It's not a reflection of an individual's understanding of the asset class or their sophistication around their understanding of an asset class. It's a kind of random line in the sand which suggests you, as a sophisticated investor, might have more tolerance for risk because you have a larger quantum of assets. And so I think the point of the article was trying to say that these poor retail investors are unsophisticated in their understanding and are being taken advantage of. But I think, sorry, go on.
I think it's harsh to say they're being taken advantage of, but one of the challenges I have with the crowdfunding platforms is I don't really see a lot of conversation around portfolio approach to investing. And why? Because that's starting to get close to financial advice, of which these platforms do not want to get involved in. And so there's this regulatory gap where the professionals approach this asset class through portfolios of companies, knowing that some hopefully will do well and some are going to go to zero. And when you take a retail investor who wants to get access to the asset class, they tend to go too big in too few, don't actually have some sophisticated frameworks to at least understand valuation and market sizing. And again, the platform doesn't want to get involved in financial advice and all of those kinds of things. And so you've got this very well-meaning environment to give retail people access to that asset class, but I'm not sure there's the support to do it. And then in my experience with these crowdfunding platforms, with some of these companies I'm sure are awesome and great opportunities for value. Then I've seen some that couldn't get professional investor capital. So they then went to the crowdfunding route because there wasn't that scrutiny, there wasn't those questions being asked. And so I think crowdfunding has an absolute space and I'm supportive of it, but it's a hard one.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is interesting that the commentary around, particularly that the fact it's even called the sophisticated investor test. And as we know, you can meet that requirement and by no means be sophisticated.
Spend some time with us.
But it is, it's an interesting democratization of an asset class, and the access to the asset class does require also some education and information. And I think I agree with you, Donna, around portfolio management, asset allocations, understanding of, particularly if it's a tech startup, like understanding of the nuances of those types of companies. But I think it's definitely got its place. I do worry if there are companies that can't close investment from venture capital firms or angel investors who then go to something like a crowdfunding platform to secure funding they otherwise wouldn't have. But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of companies for which venture and angel investment isn't appropriate. And there is, outside of crowdfunding, really very few platforms or channels for them to raise money. And we know...
Can we just differentiate quickly that we're talking about here crowdfunding on the equity part of their capital stack, not crowdfunding as in selling a product?
Correct. Yeah, that's right. And We know ourselves. We have a bunch of investors and shareholders who absolutely would like us to be the arbiter of investments and to create a portfolio for them. And then we have investors who want to pick their own investments, and to assume that the people who are investing in these platforms are not doing their homework or not reading the information that's provided. And the disclosure requirements around them are pretty good now, I think. If you look at what's required in the product disclosure documents to list your company on one of these platforms, it's pretty decent. And you've got the same sorts of disincentives or punishments if you mislead people in that way. So I see it absolutely serves a purpose. And isn't this about giving investors choice, and as well as giving new channels for companies that might not be a fit for traditional professional fund managers in the VC space?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And as usual, maybe I'm being too snooty, but the other experience I've got with crowdfunding, being on the board of a company that did it, and I think maybe as I think through, this is like a auto stabilizer. The successful crowdfundings, they actually did a lot of work to get their crowd well before they were raising. I don't think of many products. Let me say that again with some level of intelligence. I don't think there are many successful crowdfunding raisings that have occurred where someone's just randomly put stuff on and people have thrown money at it. What they did was they got their crowd, they got them all energetic, and then the crowdfunding was a mechanism to raise their capital. And advice I've given entrepreneurs that have discussed crowdfunding being right for them, I always just tell them, you've got to have done almost this top of funnel marketing work to get this rabid crew of people willing to part with their dollars for investment first, and then the crowdfunding platform is the mechanism to effectively harvest that good work and turn them into shareholders. I don't think the way it works at the moment is that there's millions of or thousands of retail investors just snapping up any old crap on there. And this article also doesn't put some time-bound stuff around some of their quoting of multiples, because 18 months ago, 20 times revenue wasn't too bad.
Well, it's not revenue. So I guess one of the other nitpickings that I have on that article is that it talks about how these startups are getting crazy valuations at 20 times earnings.
Earnings. Are they defining, this is the media though, are they defining earnings as earnings or earnings as in revenue?
They just said earnings, and I think there's a pretty well understood definition of earnings. And then they say this is compared to the ASX, which gets less than a handful multiple on its revenue.
Oh, that's a good point. That's fucking ridiculous.
That is not comparing apples with apples. Yeah. So then what I did is I went and had a look at, because they talk specifically about consumer goods in this article. So then I looked at, what's the median multiple that consumer goods companies on the ASX are getting on earnings? 30 times. So the 23 times is not ridiculous. And in fact, you look at how that changes as the company gets more mature on these platforms. So that was for companies with more than $100,000 in revenue. Then you look as it goes up the chain to 500,000 in revenue, and they're getting 10 times on earnings or 8.5 times on earnings. So I feel like there is either the author didn't understand the difference, or they're trying to create this vibe that these companies are raising at ridiculous valuations that are not seen elsewhere. And I just don't think that the data bears that out.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think the other element is recognizing the amount of work that these platforms do in vetting and selecting companies before they're actually listed.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right.
Shout out to someone like Anthony Owen with My Crowd, that the amount of work he does vetting and helping the founders understand the process and educating them through that process and saying no to a lot of offerings.
I'm pretty sure the one that one of my companies I'm on the board of, and I can't remember which platform, but I'm pretty sure I had to do a police check and all sorts of other bits and pieces. This wasn't just let anyone on.
Yeah, that's right. I think back in the day, it was very cobbled together. Today, I think it's run relatively professionally. There are checks and balances in place. Could it be better? Of course. All of these financial product platforms and services, including fund managers like us, need to make sure that we're doing whatever is best practice. But I thought it was a bit of a beat up that was
No, I think, as we know, it almost, of course, is going to be a beat up, but I will, in defense of them a little bit, if you don't live and breathe this stuff, there are some interesting nuances in this space that your average person would want to have an interest in it and actually go a little bit deeper. And that's why some longer form narrative tends to help with that, because it's not as simple as just saying all companies are the same. And that's where these articles, if I want to try and be kind and say that it's not a beat up, it's just a lack of deep understanding, but let's go with beat up. It's easier.
Yeah. But if you're a financial journalist, that is your day job. That you are supposed to live and breathe it.
That is true.
Exactly.
I did like Luke Anier's comment that it takes a founder 10 years to work out what they're doing. And I think the media might be on that learning curve as well.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
So while we're on media and startups and tech, the other story was about the streaming services being asked to kind of chip in for infrastructure by the telcos here in Australia.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's even we're recording on a platform at the moment that is streaming from the four of us. Then I download it. And by the time I've edited and whatever else, I was doing a calculation. I've got something like 8 gigabytes between ups and downs and whatever else. And so it's not just Netflix. Those things are big, but the world that we live in is just exponentially. Everything is going online.
For sure. But I guess if you're an infrastructure owner, you've built your infrastructure knowing that this was coming and you saw that as an opportunity. And then you've got infrastructure service providers who have done the same. And now they're saying the product providers should help pay for that. The consumer is already paying for that. So why should the product providers pay for it as well?
Yeah, to me, it seems weird.
Yeah. Do we charge Ford to contribute towards our roads because they're building bigger cars that have more weight on the road?
Yeah.
Or, I don't know. To me, it feels like I purchase a telescope and then I'm paying for the amount of stars that I look at. Like, to me, there's a pipe issue and then there's a data volume issue. And I remember Steve Baxter used to go on about this all the time, the way our wholesaling internet pricing is based in Australia. And I don't claim to understand this, but the fact that it's based on data as opposed to bandwidth, as opposed to pipe. And so I think we have a flaw in the Australian system in particular. But yeah, to me, it smells off.
Well, the thing that's changing, right? The pipes are there and the pipes have been built. Yeah. And the only thing that is ramping up is the data that is being consumed, which is
so they're not
radio waves and electricity. And your subscribers are paying handsome subscription fees, i.e. us, to Telstra or Optus or whatever, that we're paying on a per data basis. So what is the problem?
Are they saying that they need to lay a lot more infrastructure?
Possibly, yeah.
But which then, for me, wouldn't the people that are then consuming the infrastructure pay for it?
That's the bit that... Yeah. And don't you think we ultimately will anyway? Yeah. It feels to me like they're trying to get us to pay and the product providers to pay. They're trying to get sort of 2 bites of the cherry. Whereas, look, I've got Starlink. They've got ground stations which attach to the internet backbone. They zoom it up to a satellite, comes back down to my dish. They own all of that infrastructure. They own the ability to provide the data and they charge accordingly. And I'm not entirely sure why the Telstras or the Optuses of the world seem to say this is eating into our profits. We can't do it.
That's the thing. I'm paying for fiber. I'm already paying for a certain bandwidth speed and I'm paying for a data cap. Just factor that in.
I reckon they've had McKinsey or BCG in, and what they've done is you're missing out on two-sided marketplace revenue here. All the cool kids charge the suppliers and the customers. You should do the same. And here's our bill for $1 million. That's what I reckon's happened.
Yeah, but where else does that happen?
Two-sided marketplace. What are you talking about? You pay like a freelancer. I pay my cut, and then they take a cut from the supplier as well. They're clipping the ticket on both sides. That's a lot of the world is doing that. Coles and Woolies, they get us coming in, but then they get rebates from their suppliers as well.
That already exists for these guys. So a two-sided marketplace is I buy from this person and then I sell to you. Whereas, and what Telstra are doing is they're buying bandwidth from the NBN, for example. They're paying wholesale prices for that, selling it retail to us. That marketplace already exists and we're paying for it. It just seems To me, I just thought it seemed like a nonsensical business model, which was being made up because they seem to no longer be able to run their business at a profit.
Yeah. It feels like that. If we converted our road into a two-sided marketplace, then destinations we are driving to need to pay towards the roads, the infrastructure. So shopping centers or events or workplaces, it's just a...
Which happens because we pay tolls. But what we don't do is we don't ask the car maker to pay the toll as well.
We'll see what the problem is. It's interesting, the internet, I know all the jokes used to have Wi-Fi at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The more we come interdependent on it, it's going to become closer to shelter and water, and those that control that infrastructure and who's in charge of that infrastructure is going to become more and more important.
That's right. And I guess that's a nice segue to our deep dive for today, which is the article that Ronan Farrow wrote and published yesterday on Elon Musk.
It was a great article.
Now that you point out that your internet's provided, I just want to make sure that you've disclosed all conflicts of interest, Elaine. And
I'm curious at what point Elaine gets cut off from this conversation and suddenly Starlink stops working, as appears to be happening in the Ukraine battlefront. But my first take on that, first of all, how good is it when you have a deep dive article that's well written, long form, and touches on a number of aspects? Like, I quite enjoy it.
Absolutely. I think so. I read Ashley Vance's biography of Elon Musk a while ago when it was published, and Ronan's kind of article summarizes a lot of stuff that was already covered in that. But there's been so much that has happened since. And it was interesting, I think, for Ronan to go through the chronology of all of those things and tie them together to today's observations about what is happening. But I think there's a lot to unpack in this article, so we're definitely not going to have enough time to go through it. But the thing that was really concerning to me, and I guess relates to the previous story, was around a single person owning and controlling such critical infrastructure. So one of the reasons I think Starlink can operate at a pretty decent cost, and the telcos here are screaming about trying to get some sort of subscription fees from someone else, is because when you own it from end to end, all of a sudden the unit economics makes sense. But when someone owns it from end to end, then the network, the platform, the infrastructure is at the behest of that individual, which we have seen has had real world implications in the Ukraine. Do you guys want to expand on what that article talked about?
Yes, I guess my comment is just a step back. So you just said before, a person owning all of that. And if we go all the way back to the very beginning of this podcast, the person is an entrepreneur. And it's one of the greatest entrepreneurs that this planet has seen. And that person, if we agree that entrepreneurship comes from certain impulses and personality kinds of things, we're actually talking about a person that has some interesting character traits and demonstrates time and time again the willingness to break rules, roll out products that absolutely kill people, and that person is in charge of some massive piece of infrastructure. So it's just not your average person. So that's one
for sure
thing that I look there, and broadly those are some of the things that we have to understand. But then the question I think also becomes, is the capitalistic system allows entrepreneurs to get capital and build these things. There are so many things wrong with capitalism, but it does produce these kinds of outliers. And so how do we then find a way that if capitalism allows us entrepreneurs to build these great things, what's the tipping point of risk and control and the greater good and utilitarianism and all those kinds of things? How do we transition that bit? And I got no idea.
So for those who hadn't read the article yet, it talks about the provision by Starlink to the Ukraine, its internet capacity, critical infrastructure, as they were in dire need of an ability to communicate as they were battling on the war front with Russia. And Starlink provided, waltzed in and very seemingly philanthropically said, look, we'll donate or we'll provide a whole bunch of infrastructure via Starlink. We'll send you a whole bunch of hardware. The great thing about Starlink is because it has limited transmissibility from these satellite dishes or satellite receivers on the ground. They could actually be really confined about how they communicated. It was hard for Russia to take out their entire communication system, couldn't hack into it. And then at some point, Starlink said, guys, we can't keep providing this for free, so someone needs to pay us. And if you don't pay us, we're just going to turn it off. So holding an entire country essentially and all the allies of that country essentially to ransom, saying we need $400 million. This is costing us $400 million a year, which is ridiculous because I think SpaceX's entire operational yearly cost is $3 billion. I doubt $400 million of that is providing hardware, satellite dishes, and data to the Ukraine war effort. But let's put that aside. The question was, how can this one company, which is controlled largely by this one individual, have been allowed to come in, provide this critical infrastructure, and not have governments have some backup or some ability to ensure that would be provided for a long period of time? Effectively, the Starlink system got turned off. A whole bunch of Ukrainians died because they were unable to communicate. So the question really is twofold. One is, at what point do we go, this is not right that we've got private companies who are managing these really critical bits of infrastructure, which the government is quite dependent on, happen? And then secondarily, how much do we allow these individuals who control it to have such a critical role? And particularly when these individuals may not, and this is not a reflection of Elon, but anyone may not have the same aligned interests in protecting democracy, have the same moral compass, share the same values.
Yeah.
So interested to get your take on this, and I'm not sure there is an easy solution, but it is very worrying.
And the other two aspects for me, one was the fact Elon referenced his ability to know where Ukrainian forces were deployed and watch battle units like that, the level of intelligence.
And then spoke to Putin.
Yeah. And so he has access to this information based on the usage of Starlink and can actually see battlefield information in real time, and then is chummy with Putin. And the other aspect is...
I just want to confirm, this is the guy that does like dick memes and funny jokes on Twitter. You're just
Correct.
talking about the same guy?
And
okay, just checking.
Well,
and
it
all
has
sorts of things.
been given essentially a quasi-diplomatic role. So there was the interesting quotes there were the Pentagon saying, I don't know if I can talk to you until I talk to Elon.
Yes, absolutely. And the fact that that they describe the US military now in a race to address this issue and put their own systems in place. But the launch vehicle they have to use to do that is SpaceX.
Correct.
So
yeah.
This is not an easy...
A guy with billions of dollars of margin loans that needs to make sure that his companies stay cash flow positive so he doesn't get a call from Morgan Stanley. These are the things that
I know. And for all of the dumb decisions that we look at and go, what the hell, Elon? You look at actually what he has pulled together here.
Sure.
In terms of controlling critical infrastructure. It's not just satellites and the internet. He's really the only game in town now in terms of space, which, yes, is very important for putting up satellites, but a whole bunch of reasons as well. He now completely owns that space. He owns that space because he controls the companies that he essentially has that are doing that.
And I'm going to try and say this without sounding like my normal self. I'm going to try and say this as positively as possible, but this is I don't know whether it's entrepreneurs themselves or people that look at entrepreneurism. Elon is clearly quite bright, but it's not intelligence that gets you success often in the entrepreneurial game. It's actually personality traits. And I'm not saying Elon's not intelligent, although he does some really fucking dumb stuff. I'm just saying it just highlights that anybody that thinks that I don't have the intelligence to pull off entrepreneurship or whatever else, that's not what this game is. The game is far more these other personality traits of being Teflon, thick-skinned, big vision, head down, bum up. All of those kinds of things are what ultimately get you into a position. And sometimes life greets you with a series of steps where you're able to get that power in place.
And maybe to draw a parallel or a link to what we started out talking about, there was a lot about Elon's tendency to break rules and just go with his gut, what he wants to do, without really without any thought for the structures and systems that operate around him, because in his view, those are constraints that are unnecessary. Now, in a war type situation or in a diplomatic situation, those structures and systems have been built up over time, over a long time, in order to protect and manage risk and a whole bunch of things. And basically he's blown that out of the water and said, I'm the intermediate now. And they referenced a lot of examples, his reaction to the pandemic, his recent kind of transition to right-wing kind of leanings, the Twitter, a whole bunch of reasons examples that suggest he has absolutely no concern or consideration for the constraints of the systems that he is operating within. But this is dangerous. And I don't want to be too alarmist. I absolutely am being somewhat alarmist in my comments. But an important pillar of democracy is media. We've now got a bunch of billionaires who pretty much control the media. We've got Murdoch, we've got Bezos, Elon now controls Twitter. This is a little bit worrying from a democratic standpoint, particularly when Elon is also trying to manage his relationships with China, because that's where Teslas get manufactured. He doesn't want to piss them off. It just starts to feel very worrying.
Have you guys watched The Smartest Guys in the Room yet, the Enron story?
No, yeah. I need to.
There's a group of people that were effectively in charge of California's energy grid. And when there's these commercial self-interests behind the scenes, they then use that mechanism of that grid to drive earnings, and it was catastrophic. And so the blending of the capitalistic system creating these things separated from then the management of these things, to me, that's the transition that needs to occur. But I don't want to default to Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, but people will default to their position, and having one or a small group of people in charge of these assets that get depended on is a problem. Now, what can we do with it? I invite everybody into my cave that I'm going to build to escape the inevitable end of the earth. I'm joking.
No, but it is really alarming to think that a country's forces who are at war get their communications shut off and held ransom for an invoice. Like, this is insanity, and this is the destruction of democracy.
And also just, I guess, part of, look, a private citizen or a private company shouldn't have to provide that stuff for free. So It should get covered, whatever the cost is. But these things needed to be sorted out beforehand so that they weren't in that position. And there was a couple of comments about how he went in as the savior. And there is a number of comments from Reid Hoffman and Sam Altman, who have both worked with Elon, about how Elon has a view that the world needs to be saved, but only if he can be the one to save it. So he wants to run in, be the savior. And it's apparently then sometime after that he goes, oh, people are dying. Actually, my infrastructure is being used to kill people, kill Russians. Which is entrepreneurial. I'm not sure I'm cool with that. Yeah. So there's no kind of thought.
An entrepreneur
unintended consequences.
And planning.
No, but there is, Don, one of your things was, if we're going to talk about this, there needs to be some learnings for entrepreneurs, right? Yeah. And I think there is this tendency for this just-in-time problem solving, right? Yeah. Or having the capacity to just have stuff come at you, you solve it in real time, you move on to the next thing. Fine. But the kind of operating without thinking through what the longer-term consequences of some of these decisions, I think, is where entrepreneurs are often weak. And in this particular case, maybe it's a disingenuous comment he made that, oh, I hadn't thought through that, and maybe I'm not so comfortable with that now, as a way to wash him off of any consequences associated with it. But
often
you have to think through these consequences.
Getting a business off the ground often needs that sort of almost flexible naivety that gets you into those problems, because it helps get that momentum. It's that transition when you've got a real thing that customers and staff and shareholders are actually depending on. It's transitioning into more planning and more thought up front. And so it's celebrating and understanding that creating something to begin with is different to running the thing. And sometimes if you can't do that yourself, bring someone else in or bring a team in.
Yeah.
And also looping back to the conversation about narcissists, that inability to accept consequences of previous decisions. I actually remain committed. Yeah, look, I don't want to make it all about narcs, but it usually is.
We could do our own version, our own show of Narcos.
Oh, that would be a whole series.
Oh my God, couldn't we? Wow.
Yeah.
Look, implore everyone to read the article. It's not behind a paywall. You can read it on New Yorker. It's a long read. It'll be in the show notes. Keen to hear everyone's thoughts about this.
Yeah.
As you can see, we're not Elon haters, but we're also not Elon stans, despite me owning several Elon products. This is a bigger issue than that.
Hate the player, not the game.
Yeah, correct. It feels worrying that our governments are privatizing all this stuff. And in the era of the information age or the technology age and technology billionaires being able to scale their things so quickly that they get monopolies, that my view is there needs to be a different approach.
Totally.
All right. That's the news of the week, I think. What are we looking forward to this week, guys?
Oh, yeah. What are we excited about?
I'm looking forward to getting the Luke and Near podcast out today.
Yeah, great.
And so by the time you're listening to this was 2 days ago. So I'm excited. I'm going to get this out today.
It was a good chat. It was a really good discussion.
Yeah, I'm excited to get that out and excited for the weekend.
That's good.
What are you excited for?
Yeah, I'm also excited for the weekend, heading down to the Gold Coast for a mate's birthday.
Again?
Yeah, last week I stayed in Brisbane last week. Quiet weekend.
Good to hear. Aaron, wedding planning?
Yes, wedding planning. But outside of that, I'm heading off to the, what's it called? The Universities Bonfire, which is not setting fire to universities, but it's an innovation festival at UQ. And so I'll be talking about going global, which will be good.
Great.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Inspiring young minds.
Hopefully. That's the goal.
Great. I'm excited about the fact that my waiting list for Great Dane puppies is getting longer.
Yeah.
Yes.
For those who don't know, I'm a Great Dane breeder and have been experimenting with website creation and Google Ads and search engine optimization, and it seems to be paying off. So I'm pretty excited about that.
The medicine that we try and work with entrepreneurs on is not medicine we don't try and take ourselves.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. And for those listening, if you're interested in puppies, expecting a litter around December, Jan.
Let's put the website in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome.
This show was brought to you by Heathstead Danes.
Heathstead Danes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep. Awesome. All right,
All
guys.
right.
Have a great
See you
day.
soon.
You too.
Bye.